The hall went silent, the moment Kane's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "You are useless." 200 pairs of eyes turned toward Elena, who stood frozen in the center of the gathering floor, her hands still trembling from the failed hunting trial. The fire in the great hall crackled, but nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The woman who had stood beside Kane for 6 years, who had given up her own pack to join his, who had smiled through every cold night and every missed promise, now stood alone, under the weight of a single sentence spoken in front of everyone she had ever tried to belong to. Elena did not cry. She wanted to, but something inside her had already begun to shift, like a door quietly closing on a room she would never enter again. She looked at Kane, waiting for him to take the words back, to soften them with an apology, or even a glance of regret. He did neither. He simply turned to his beta, Marcus, and began discussing the next trial, as if nothing had happened, as if the woman standing 3 feet away from him had not just been publicly stripped of everything she had built. The other wolves shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away out of pity. Others whispered behind cupped hands, already shaping the story they would tell later. Elena felt the heat rise in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from something colder and sharper. It was clarity. For the first time in years, she saw Kane exactly as he was, and she saw herself exactly as she had allowed herself to become. She thought back to the day she arrived in Kane's territory, young and hopeful, believing that loyalty and patience would eventually earn her a place at his side that felt like home. She remembered the early months when he had been attentive, when he had complimented her strength during training, and praised her sharp instincts during patrols. But somewhere along the way, attention had turned into expectation, and expectation had hardened into judgment. Every mistake she made was remembered. Every success was forgotten by morning. She had told herself it was simply the pressure of being a future Luna, that all mates faced trials like this. But standing there, humiliated in front of the entire pack, she finally understood that this was not pressure. This was cruelty wearing the mask of leadership. A younger wolf named Grace, barely out of her training years, tugged gently at Elena's sleeve. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her eyes wide with concern. Elena looked down at her and forced the corners of her mouth into something resembling a smile. "I will be," she said, though she was not entirely sure she believed it yet. Grace nodded, unconvinced, and stepped back as the gathering resumed its usual rhythm, the awkward silence swallowed by nervous conversation and the clinking of cups. Elena's mind raced as she stood there, replaying every insult Kane had thrown at her over the past few months. The night he told her she moved too slowly during a border patrol. The afternoon he mocked her hesitation during a sparring match, calling it weakness in front of his warriors. The countless times he compared her, sometimes directly and sometimes with a raised eyebrow, to wolves he considered more capable, more worthy, more deserving of the title she had spent years trying to earn. Each memory, stacked on top of the last, forming a weight she had carried silently, believing that silence was strength. But tonight, something inside her refused to stay quiet any longer. She turned without a word and walked toward the large wooden doors at the back of the hall. Her steps were steady, deliberate, each one echoing against the stone floor despite the murmur of voices around her. She did not look back at Kane. She did not look at Marcus, who watched her with narrowed eyes, clearly sensing that something had shifted in the air. She simply walked, her spine straight, her chin lifted, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Outside, the night air hit her like a wave of relief. The cold bit at her skin, but it felt clean, honest, nothing like the suffocating warmth of the hall she had just left behind. She stood on the stone steps for a long moment, staring out at the dark tree line that marked the edge of Kane's territory. The same trees she had watched for years, the same border she had patrolled 100 times without complaint. Footsteps approached behind her. She recognized the rhythm before she turned around. It was Lily, one of the few wolves in the pack who had never treated her like an outsider despite her position. Lily's expression was soft, careful, the kind of look people gave when they were afraid a single wrong word might shatter something fragile. "You don't have to go back in there," Lily said quietly. "Not tonight." Elena exhaled slowly, watching her breath curl into the cold air. "I don't think I want to go back in there ever again," she admitted, the words surprising even herself as they left her mouth. Lily's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached out and squeezed Elena's hand. A small gesture that meant more in that moment than any speech could have. "Whatever you decide," Lily said. "You deserve better than what happened in there." Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice just yet. She looked past Lily toward the hall, where the golden light spilled out through the windows, illuminating shapes of wolves still caught in the aftermath of what had just occurred. She wondered how many of them agreed with Kane, and how many simply lacked the courage to say otherwise. As Lily returned inside, promising to cover for Elena's absence for as long as she could, Elena remained on the steps, staring at the tree line. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, toward the territory that bordered Kane's land to the east, the territory ruled by Alpha Damien Cross, a name that had become almost forbidden within Kane's pack. Damien and Kane had been rivals for years, their history stretching back to a territorial dispute that neither side had ever fully resolved. Elena had heard whispers about Damien, some painting him as ruthless, others describing him as fiercely protective of his own people. She had never met him. She had never had a reason to. Until now. The thought arrived slowly at first, tentative and uncertain, but the longer she stood there in the cold, the more it solidified into something resembling resolve. She had nowhere else to turn. Her own birth pack had dissolved years ago, absorbed into a larger territory after a conflict that left her without a home to return to. She had built her entire identity around her place beside Kane, and now that place had been stripped from her in front of everyone who mattered. She thought of her mother, long gone, who used to tell her that a wolf's worth was never determined by another wolf's words, no matter how loudly they were spoken. She thought of the quiet strength she had buried beneath years of trying to please a man who had never truly seen her. And she thought, with a clarity that startled her, that perhaps it was time to stop waiting for someone to recognize her value, and instead go find a place where that value was simply understood. The decision settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every part of her that had grown accustomed to smallness. She would not stay another night beneath Kane's roof, waiting for an apology that would never come. She would not spend another gathering standing silently while he tore her down in front of the very people she had sworn to protect alongside him. She turned and walked toward the small cabin she had shared with Kane at the edge of the training grounds, moving quickly and quietly, careful not to draw attention. Inside, she gathered only what she needed: a worn leather satchel, a few changes of clothes, the small carved wolf pendant her mother had given her before she died. She left behind the jewelry Kane had given her during better times, the dresses he had once admired her in, the life that had never truly belonged to her in the first place. By the time she stepped back outside, the moon had risen higher, casting pale light across the training grounds where she had spent countless hours proving herself, only to be told, in the end, that none of it had mattered. She took one last look at the cabin, at the hall in the distance, at the pack she had called family for 6 years, and then she turned toward the tree line and began to walk. She did not run, she did not shift. She simply walked, one steady step after another, crossing the training grounds, passing the edge of the pack houses, moving toward the dark line of trees that separated Kane's territory from the unknown world beyond it. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called after her. The pack that had witnessed her humiliation now seemed content to let her disappear into the night without a second thought, and somehow, that indifference hurt almost as much as Kane's words had. As she reached the tree line, she paused and looked back one final time. The hall still glowed in the distance, warm and golden, filled with wolves who would likely forget this night by morning, who would move on with their lives as though nothing significant had occurred. But for Elena, everything had changed. She could feel it in the way her chest had opened, in the way the cold air no longer felt like punishment, but like possibility. She stepped into the trees and did not look back again. The forest was quieter than she expected, the usual chorus of night creatures replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to hold its breath alongside her. She moved carefully, guided more by instinct than by any clear plan, her senses sharpening with every step deeper into unfamiliar territory. She knew, vaguely, the direction of Damien's land, having overheard enough conversations among Kane's warriors to piece together a rough understanding of where the border lay. But knowing the direction and actually crossing into rival territory were two very different things, and as the trees grew denser around her, doubt began to creep into the edges of her resolve. What if Damien's pack saw her only as an enemy, a spy sent by Kane to test their defenses? What if crossing this border only led her from one kind of danger into another, trading humiliation for something far worse? She slowed her pace, considering turning back, considering simply finding somewhere neutral to wait out the night and think more carefully about her next move. But then she remembered Kane's voice, sharp and dismissive, echoing through the silent hall. Useless. The word had lodged itself somewhere deep, and she refused to let it be the last thing she ever allowed herself to believe about who she was. She straightened her shoulders and continued forward, pushing doubt aside, with the same determination that had carried her through 6 years of trying to prove herself to a man who had never truly wanted to see her succeed. The trees eventually began to thin, giving way to a wide clearing, bathed in silver moonlight. Elena paused at the edge of it, her heart pounding, as she realized she had likely reached the border itself. Somewhere beyond this clearing lay Damien's territory, a land she knew almost nothing about, ruled by a man whose reputation had reached her only in fragments and rumors. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and stepped into the clearing. The moment her foot touched the open grass, a low growl rumbled from the shadows on the opposite side, and Elena froze, her pulse spiking, as 3 shapes emerged from the tree line ahead. Warriors, their postures tense and alert, clearly having sensed her presence long before she had sensed theirs. She raised her hands slowly, palms open, signaling that she meant no harm, though she understood how unlikely it was that they would simply take her word for it. "I'm not here to fight," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to speak with your alpha." The warriors exchanged glances, clearly weighing whether to believe her, or simply drive her back across the border where she belonged. One of them, a tall wolf with sharp eyes and a scar running along his jaw, stepped forward, studying her carefully. "You're from Kane's pack," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, his tone laced with suspicion. "I was," Elena replied, and something in the way she said it seemed to catch his attention, softening the hard line of his expression just slightly. He studied her a moment longer, taking in her tired eyes, the small satchel slung over her shoulder, the absence of any weapon or aggressive posture. Whatever he saw seemed to convince him, at least enough to lower his guard slightly. "Wait here," he said finally, before turning to one of the others and murmuring something too quiet for Elena to catch. The second warrior disappeared back into the trees, presumably to alert someone of higher rank, while the scarred wolf and the remaining warrior kept careful watch over Elena, their eyes never fully leaving her. She stood in the clearing, feeling suddenly small beneath the vast night sky, uncertain whether she had just made the bravest decision of her life, or the most reckless one. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, before the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Elena turned toward the sound, and her breath caught slightly, as a figure emerged from the tree line, moving with the kind of quiet authority that immediately marked him as someone of significant power within this territory. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly disheveled as though he had been pulled from rest to respond to this unexpected disturbance along his border. His eyes, even in the dim moonlight, held a sharpness that suggested he missed very little, and as they settled on Elena, she felt an unfamiliar sensation settle over her, something between wariness and an odd, inexplicable sense of safety. This, she realized with quiet certainty, was Damien Cross. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with the same careful assessment his warriors had shown, though his expression carried something else beneath the caution, something closer to curiosity. "You're a long way from home," he said finally, his voice low and even. "I don't have a home to go back to," Elena replied before she could stop herself, the honesty surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Something shifted in Damien's expression, the sharp edges softening just slightly, as he took in the weight behind her words. He glanced briefly at his warriors, a silent signal passing between them, and they stepped back, giving him space to approach her more directly. "You're from Kane's pack," he said again, though his tone carried less accusation this time, and more simple observation. Elena nodded, unable to fully meet his eyes now that she stood before him. "I was his mate," she said quietly. "Until tonight." Damien's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly at the admission, and Elena wondered, briefly, how much he already knew about Kane's reputation, how many stories had reached him over the years, about the way his rival treated those beneath him. Whatever he knew, he did not press her further in that moment, Instead, he studied her for a long, silent stretch, as though weighing a decision far more significant than simply whether to let her pass through his territory. "Come," he said finally, turning toward the tree line. "You look like you haven't eaten in days, and you're shaking from more than just the cold." Elena hesitated for only a moment, before following him, her exhaustion finally catching up to her, now that the adrenaline of her escape had begun to fade. As they walked deeper into unfamiliar territory, she stole a glance at the man beside her, wondering what exactly she had just walked into, and wondering, too, whether this decision would prove to be her salvation, or simply the beginning of an entirely new kind of struggle. Whatever it was, she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she crossed fully into Damien Cross's land. She was never going back to the woman Kane had convinced her she was. That woman had been left behind in the clearing, beneath the moonlight, somewhere between one territory and the next. They walked in silence for a while, Damien keeping his pace slow enough for her to match, though she suspected it had little to do with courtesy, and everything to do with quietly assessing her, the way any careful leader would assess an unknown element entering his land. The forest here felt different from Kane's territory. The trees older, the air carrying a stillness that felt less like emptiness, and more like peace. Elena found herself breathing more easily with every step, though she couldn't yet tell if that was simply exhaustion loosening its grip, or something deeper beginning to settle inside her. "You said you don't have a home to return to," Damien said eventually, breaking the silence without looking at her. "What do you mean by that?" Elena considered how much to share, uncertain how much trust she could extend to a man she had known for less than an hour, rival alpha or not. But something about the steadiness of his voice, the absence of judgment in his tone, made the words easier to offer than she expected. "My birth pact dissolved years ago," she said. "I joined Kane's pack believing it would become my home. Tonight, in front of everyone, he made it clear that it never truly was." Damien's steps slowed almost imperceptibly, and when he finally looked at her, his expression was unreadable, though something in his eyes suggested he understood more than he was willing to say aloud just yet. "Whatever happened tonight," he said, "you're safe here. At least for now." The words settled over Elena like a blanket she hadn't realized she needed, and for the first time since Kane's voice had shattered the silence of the gathering hall, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of expectation pressing down on her chest. They reached the edge of Damien's main settlement, as the first hints of dawn began to color the horizon, and Elena found herself staring at a village unlike anything she had known in Kane's territory. It was smaller, quieter, but there was a warmth to it that had nothing to do with the fires burning low in the windows. Even at this early hour, a few wolves moved about, nodding respectfully to their alpha as he passed, their eyes drifting curiously toward Elena, but without the open hostility she had braced herself for. "You'll stay in the guest quarters near the healer's house," Damien said, guiding her toward a modest wooden building at the edge of the settlement. "Nobody will bother you there." Elena nodded, gratitude tightening her throat in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she managed, "for not turning me away." Damien paused at the door, studying her for a long moment before responding. "I've heard enough about how Kane treats those under his protection to know that whatever brought you here tonight, it likely wasn't a small thing." His voice hardened slightly on Kane's name, though he quickly softened it again as he continued. "You don't owe me an explanation. Rest. We'll talk more when you're ready." As he turned to leave, Elena found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Why are you helping me? I'm not even from your pack. I could be a threat for all you know." Damien glanced back at her, the faintest hint of something unreadable flickering across his expression. "Because 6 years ago, someone did the same for me, when I had nowhere else to turn," he said simply. "And because no one deserves to be told they're useless by the very person who's supposed to stand beside them." He left before she could respond, disappearing back toward the center of the settlement, and Elena stood alone in the doorway of the guest quarters, watching the sky slowly brighten above unfamiliar rooftops. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a version of her life that did not revolve around proving her worth to someone who had already decided she had none. Inside, the guest quarters were simple but comfortable. A small bed tucked against one wall, a modest fireplace already lit against the early morning chill. Elena set her satchel down and sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the night finally catching up to her all at once. She thought of Kane, of the hall, of the silence that had followed his words, and she thought, too, of Damien's steady voice cutting through the darkness of the clearing. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether Kane would even notice her absence beyond the inconvenience it might cause him, or whether Damien's hospitality would extend beyond this single night. But as exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not safety exactly, not yet, but the quiet possibility of it, resting just beyond reach, waiting to be claimed. Outside, the sun began to rise fully over Damien Cross's territory, casting long shadows across a land that Elena had crossed into as a broken woman fleeing humiliation, and would, in time, come to know as something entirely different. But that was a story still waiting to unfold, one slow, deliberate step at a time, far from the hall where a single cruel word had once defined her, and closer, with each passing hour, to a place where it never would again. News of Elena's disappearance reached Kane by mid-morning, delivered hesitantly by Marcus, who had learned over the years that certain information was best presented carefully, if at all. Kane's initial reaction was dismissive, almost bored, as though the absence of his mate was little more than a minor inconvenience in an otherwise busy day. It wasn't until Marcus mentioned the direction of her tracks, traced faintly along the eastern border by two of the younger trackers, that Kane's expression shifted into something colder and far more attentive. "She crossed into Damien's territory," Kane said slowly, the words tasting foreign and unwelcome in his mouth. Marcus nodded carefully, watching his Alpha's face for the shift he knew was coming. "It appears so." Kane said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tightening as pieces began to fall into place. He had spent years building his reputation as an Alpha, whose authority went unquestioned, whose mate stood loyally beside him, regardless of circumstance. The idea that Elena, quiet, obedient Elena, had not only left but had chosen, of all places, to seek refuge with his most bitter rival, struck him as something closer to betrayal than mere absence. "Bring me everything you know about the border crossing," Kane said finally, his voice deceptively calm, in a way that made even Marcus tense slightly. "And say nothing of this outside these walls until I decide how to handle it." Marcus nodded, and turned to leave, though he paused briefly at the door. "Alpha," he said carefully, with respect, perhaps it would be wise to consider why she left in the first place, before deciding how to bring her back. Kane's eyes snapped toward him, sharp and unreadable. "That will be all, Marcus." Marcus left without another word, though the question lingered in the air, long after the door closed behind him, settling uncomfortably into a silence that Kane had no intention of examining too closely. Whatever guilt might have existed beneath his pride remained buried, replaced instead by a growing determination to reclaim what he considered rightfully his, regardless of the reasons that had driven her away in the first place. Across the border, Elena woke to the soft sound of birdsong drifting through the small window of the guest quarters, and for a brief, disoriented moment, she forgot entirely where she was. Then the memories of the previous night settled back over her, and she sat up slowly, taking in the unfamiliar room with clearer eyes than she had managed in the exhausted haze of early morning. A gentle knock sounded at the door before she could gather her thoughts further, and she opened it to find a young woman standing outside, holding a small tray of food and offering a warm, if slightly curious, smile. "Alpha Damien asked me to bring you breakfast and see if you needed anything." Elena accepted the tray gratefully, surprised by how genuinely welcoming Sophie's expression seemed, without any of the guarded suspicion she had braced herself for. "Thank you," Elena said. "This is more than I expected." Sophie shrugged lightly. "Alpha Damien doesn't turn people away when they need help. It's kind of his thing." She hesitated a moment before adding, more gently, "Whatever happened wherever you came from, you're safe here. People talk, but nobody here is going to judge you for it." The kindness in Sophie's voice caught Elena off guard, and she found herself blinking back unexpected emotion as she thanked her again, before Sophie continued on her way. Alone once more, Elena sat by the small window, eating slowly, watching the settlement below begin its day. Wolves moved about their business, children ran between houses, laughter drifted up from somewhere near the training grounds. It was, she realized, an entirely different rhythm than the one she had grown accustomed to under Kane's rule, one that felt less like survival and more like simply living. By midday, curiosity finally outweighed her exhaustion, and Elena stepped outside the guest quarters, intending only to stretch her legs along the edge of the settlement. She hadn't expected to encounter Damien so soon, standing near the training grounds, overseeing a group of younger warriors as they practiced hand-to-hand combat drills. He noticed her before she could retreat, and though she braced herself for some formal acknowledgement of her presence, he simply nodded toward her, gesturing for her to approach if she wished. She hesitated only briefly, before crossing the distance between them, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said as she reached him. "You're not interrupting," Damien replied, his eyes still tracking the movements of his warriors, even as he spoke to her. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Elena admitted honestly. Damien glanced at her then, studying her expression carefully. "Good," he said simply, though something in his tone suggested he understood exactly how much effort it had taken her to sleep at all after the events of the previous night. They stood together for a while, watching the training in comfortable silence, and Elena found herself unexpectedly at ease, despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the man beside her, a man she had spent years hearing described only in terms of rivalry and threat. Nothing about him matched the picture she had built in her mind, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time since crossing the border, how much of what she had believed about the world beyond Kane's territory had been shaped entirely by Kane himself. "You're staring," Damien said eventually, a faint hint of amusement threading through his otherwise steady tone. Elena flushed slightly, caught. "I'm trying to understand why you're being so kind to me," she admitted. "I crossed into your territory uninvited. I'm the mate of your rival. By every logic I've been taught, you should see me as a liability, not a guest." Damien considered her words for a long moment before responding, his expression thoughtful. "Logic and decency don't always align," he said finally. "You needed help. I had the ability to offer it. Whatever exists between Kane and me has nothing to do with you." The simplicity of his answer struck Elena more deeply than she expected, and she found herself studying him with new curiosity, wondering what kind of history had shaped a man capable of separating rivalry from compassion so cleanly, when everything she had known under Kane's rule had taught her the opposite. Before she could respond further, one of Damien's warriors approached, delivering a message that required his immediate attention, and he excused himself with a brief nod, leaving Elena alone once more at the edge of the training grounds. She watched him walk away, his presence commanding without ever feeling forceful, and she realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not thinking about Kane at all. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that Elena had not experienced in years. Sophie became something close to a friend, checking in on her regularly, introducing her gradually to other members of Damien's pack, who greeted her with cautious but genuine warmth. Nobody pressed her for details about what had happened in Kane's territory, though she suspected word had traveled quickly enough that most already had some understanding of the situation. Instead, they simply allowed her space to exist without expectation, a courtesy she had nearly forgotten was possible. Meanwhile, tension continued to build on the other side of the border, where Kane's pride festered into something increasingly dangerous, and where the quiet defiance of one woman's departure was slowly transforming into the spark of a conflict neither territory could yet fully anticipate. Kane summoned his closest warriors on the fourth morning after Elena's disappearance, gathering them in the same hall where he had once humiliated her without a second thought. His voice carried none of the casual dismissal he had shown Marcus days earlier. Instead, it was sharp, controlled, laced with something that resembled wounded pride, far more than genuine concern for the woman who had once stood at his side. "She has embarrassed this pack," Kane said, pacing slowly before his assembled warriors. "By fleeing to Damien Cross, she has made a mockery of everything we stand for. This cannot go unanswered." A young warrior named Ethan shifted uncomfortably near the back of the group, exchanging a glance with the wolf beside him. Whispers had already begun circulating among the lower ranks, quiet conversations about what exactly had driven Elena to leave in the first place, conversations Kane remained entirely unaware of, or perhaps simply unwilling to acknowledge. "What do you intend to do, Alpha?" Marcus asked carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who had learned long ago how easily Kane's temper could shift direction. Kane stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. "I intend to remind Damien Cross exactly where the boundaries of his territory lie," he said finally. "And I intend to remind Elena exactly what she abandoned when she chose to run rather than face her responsibilities." The warriors exchanged uneasy glances, none of them daring to voice the doubt that lingered beneath the surface of Kane's declaration. Whatever loyalty they held toward their alpha, few among them believed that Elena's departure had been driven by mere cowardice, and fewer still believed that Kane's wounded pride constituted sufficient justification for the kind of confrontation he seemed intent on pursuing. Across the border, Elena remained largely unaware of the storm building on the other side, absorbed instead in the slow, steady process of rediscovering pieces of herself she had long forgotten existed. Damien had offered her a place within his training grounds, not as an obligation, but as an opportunity, and she had accepted with a hesitance that gradually gave way to something closer to eagerness with each passing day. "You move differently than most fighters I've trained," Damien observed one afternoon, watching as Elena executed a series of defensive maneuvers under the guidance of one of his senior warriors, a steady, patient wolf named Nathan, more calculated, less reliant on brute strength. Elena paused, wiping sweat from her brow as she caught her breath. "Kane always said my technique was too cautious," she admitted, "that I hesitated too much." Damien's expression tightened slightly at the mention of his rival, though he kept his tone even. "Hesitation and calculation aren't the same thing," he said. "One is fear, the other is intelligence. From what I've seen, yours is the latter." The observation settled over Elena with unexpected weight, a small crack forming in the foundation of everything Kane had spent years convincing her to believe about her own abilities. She had spent so long measuring herself against his expectations that she had forgotten to consider whether those expectations had ever been fair to begin with. Nathan, sensing the shift in the conversation, offered a small nod of encouragement before stepping back to allow Elena a moment to process Damien's words. "For what it's worth," Nathan added, "most of us would take calculated over reckless any day. Reckless gets people killed." Elena managed a small, genuine smile, the first she had offered freely since arriving in Damien's territory. "Thank you," she said, "both of you." As the days turned into weeks, Elena's presence within Damien's pack became less of a curiosity and more of a quiet, steady fixture. She trained alongside the warriors during the mornings, assisted the healer with gathering herbs in the afternoons, and found herself, more often than she expected, sharing meals with Damien as the sun set over the training grounds, their conversations drifting easily between practical matters of pack life and quieter, more personal reflections neither of them had anticipated sharing so freely. "You never talk about your past," Elena observed one evening, as they sat together near the edge of the settlement, the fading light casting long shadows across the grass. "Everyone assumes so much about you, but I realize I know almost nothing beyond what Kane's pack whispered." Damien was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "There isn't much to tell that would surprise you," he said eventually. "I lost my parents young, to a conflict not unlike the kind Kane seems determined to provoke now. I built this pack from very little, determined that no one under my protection would ever feel as powerless as I did back then." Elena studied him carefully, understanding, for the first time, the depth behind the compassion he had shown her since the moment she crossed into his territory. "Is that why you took me in?" she asked quietly. "Because you understood what it felt like to have nowhere else to turn?" "Partly," Damien admitted, meeting her eyes directly. "But it became something more than that, the longer you stayed." The admission hung between them, quiet and unspoken in its fullest meaning, though both of them seemed to understand exactly what it implied. Elena felt something warm unfurl in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation she hadn't allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember, not since the earliest days with Kane, before disappointment had slowly eroded whatever affection had once existed between them. "I should be careful," Elena said softly, though there was little conviction behind the words. "I only just left one complicated situation. I don't want to run into another." Damien nodded slowly, respecting the caution in her tone, even as something flickered briefly in his expression, something that looked almost like restrained hope. "There's no pressure here," he said. "Whatever this becomes, or doesn't become, you'll always have a place in this pack. That was true the moment you crossed the border, and it remains true now." Elena appreciated the sincerity behind his words more than she could easily express, and for a while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to emerge above the settlement, neither of them feeling the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary conversation. It was during this same stretch of peaceful weeks that word finally reached Damien of Kane's growing agitation along the border, delivered by scouts who had noticed increased patrol activity and a subtle but unmistakable shift in the tension radiating from Kane's territory. Damien received the reports calmly, though the set of his jaw betrayed a quiet readiness beneath the surface composure. "He's building toward something," Nathan said during one such briefing, standing alongside Damien as they reviewed the scouting reports. "The question is whether it's posturing or genuine intent." "With Kane," Damien replied, "it's rarely just posturing. His pride doesn't allow for empty gestures." Elena, who had been assisting the healer nearby and overheard fragments of the conversation, felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Despite everything, despite the humiliation and the years of quiet suffering, some small part of her had hoped that Kane would simply let her go, that his pride would find some other outlet rather than escalating into open conflict with a rival pack. That hope, she now realized, had likely been naive from the beginning. She approached Damien later that evening, finding him alone near the edge of the training grounds, his expression thoughtful as he studied the darkening tree line toward the border. "This is because of me, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "Kane wouldn't be doing this if I hadn't crossed into your territory." Damien turned to face her, his expression softening slightly at the guilt evident in her voice. "Kane and I have had unresolved tension for years, long before you ever arrived," he said. "You may have accelerated things, but you didn't create this conflict. That responsibility belongs entirely to him. But if something happens," Elena pressed, "if this turns into something worse, it will be because he wants me back, and I'm the reason your pack is in danger." Damien stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You are not responsible for another man's inability to control his pride," he said. "Whatever happens next, we will face it together, and it will never be because you weren't worth protecting." The certainty in his voice steadied something within her that had been trembling since she first overheard the scouting reports, and though the anxiety didn't fully disappear, it settled into something more manageable, something she could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. Over the following days, Damien increased security along the border, without escalating aggression himself, a careful balance meant to protect his territory, without provoking Kane further than necessary. Elena watched him navigate the mounting tension with a steadiness she found herself admiring more with each passing hour, a stark contrast to the volatile unpredictability she had grown accustomed to under Kane's leadership. It was during a quiet evening training session, weeks after her arrival, that Elena finally allowed herself to fully acknowledge what had been building beneath the surface of her growing friendship with Damien. They had been practicing a defensive technique together, closer than usual, and as Damien guided her through a correction in her stance, his hand resting briefly against her arm, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of training. Damien noticed the shift in her expression and paused, studying her carefully. "Elena," he said softly, "if I've overstepped." "You haven't," she interrupted quietly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I think I've just been afraid to admit what I've been feeling." Something shifted in Damien's expression, careful hope breaking through the composed exterior he had maintained since her arrival. "And what is that?" he asked gently. Elena took a steadying breath, meeting his eyes directly. "That, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel like myself around someone. Not who they expect me to be, just myself." Damien's hand found hers, gentle and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She didn't. Instead, she allowed herself, for the first time since crossing into his territory, to simply exist in a moment without bracing for judgment or disappointment. "I've admired your strength since the night you walked into that clearing," Damien said quietly. "Not because you needed saving, but because of how clearly you refused to let anyone convince you that you did." The words settled over Elena with a weight entirely different from anything Kane had ever offered her, a recognition of strength rather than a demand for it. And as the stars continued their slow climb across the darkening sky, she allowed herself, cautiously and deliberately, to imagine a future built on exactly that kind of recognition. But even as something new and hopeful began to take root between them, the shadow of Kane's mounting fury continued to stretch across the border, a storm gathering just beyond the peace they had begun to build, waiting for the moment it would inevitably break. That moment arrived on a cool morning nearly a month after Elena's departure, When Cain himself appeared at the border, flanked by a dozen of his most loyal warriors, his expression carved from the same cold determination that had driven Elena from his hall in the first place. Word reached Damien within minutes, and he moved quickly to meet the confrontation head-on, unwilling to allow Cain's presence to go unanswered on the edge of his own territory. Elena watched from a distance, her heart pounding as she recognized Cain's unmistakable silhouette across the clearing, the same clearing she had crossed weeks earlier as a woman running from humiliation. Now she stood on the opposite side, no longer the same person who had fled into the darkness that night, and as Damien moved to stand between her and the man who had once claimed her as his own, she felt something steady settle within her, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed until this exact moment. "You have something that belongs to me," Cain called across the clearing, his voice carrying the same cold authority he had once used to dismiss her worth in front of an entire pack. Damien's expression remained calm, though his eyes carried a sharp warning as he responded. "She belongs to no one but herself," he said evenly, "and she's chosen to remain here, under my protection, for as long as she wishes." Cain's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting past Damien to find Elena standing further back, watching the confrontation unfold with a steadiness that clearly unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Elena," he called, his tone shifting into something almost persuasive, an echo of the man she had once believed he could be. "Come home, we can put this behind us." Elena stepped forward, past the line of Damien's warriors, until she stood close enough for Cain to see clearly the change that had taken place within her since the night he called her useless in front of everyone she had ever trusted. "I am home," she said simply, her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt beneath the surface. "This is where I belong now." The words landed heavily across the clearing, and Cain's expression twisted briefly with something raw, before hardening back into cold determination. Whatever softness had existed in his voice moments earlier disappeared entirely, replaced by the same rigid pride that had driven him to this border in the first place. "This isn't over," Cain said, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Elena standing confidently beside his rival. "You will regret this choice." He turned sharply, gesturing for his warriors to retreat, though the threat in his final words lingered heavily in the air, long after he disappeared back across the border. Damien watched him go with careful vigilance, his hand finding Elena's shoulder in a gesture of quiet reassurance, as the tension in the clearing slowly began to ease. "He won't let this go easily," Damien said quietly, once Cain's warriors had fully retreated from view. "I know," Elena replied, her voice steady, despite the lingering unease in her chest, "but neither will I." The declaration surprised even herself, though as she said it, she felt the truth of it settle fully into place. Whatever came next, whatever conflict Cain's wounded pride might still ignite, she was no longer the woman who would simply stand silently and absorb the consequences of someone else's cruelty. She had crossed a border weeks ago as someone broken and uncertain, and standing here now, beside a man who had shown her what genuine respect looked like, she understood clearly that she had no intention of ever going back. In the days following Cain's appearance at the border, life within Damien's territory continued, with a deliberate steadiness that Elena found herself grateful for, even as an undercurrent of tension lingered beneath the surface of everyday routines. Damien increased patrols along the eastern boundary, not out of panic, but out of careful preparation, unwilling to be caught unprepared should Cain decide to act on the threat he had left hanging in the clearing. Sophie found Elena one afternoon, sitting near the healer's garden, absently sorting through a basket of herbs while her mind clearly wandered elsewhere. "You've been quiet since the confrontation," Sophie observed, settling down beside her. Elena offered a small, tired smile. "I keep thinking about what he said, that I would regret this choice." She paused, setting down the herbs in her hands. "Some small part of me is afraid he might be right, not because I doubt my decision, but because I'm afraid of what he might do to prove a point." Sophie considered this for a moment before responding. "Fear like that makes sense," she said gently. "But from what I've seen since you arrived, you're not the same woman who crossed that border a month ago. Whatever Cain does next, you won't be facing it as someone powerless." The reassurance settled some of the anxiety coiled in Elena's chest, though it didn't entirely dissolve it. She had spent years learning to anticipate Cain's moods, to read the subtle shifts in his temperament that often preceded his cruelest outbursts. and something about his final words at the border had carried the unmistakable weight of a promise rather than an empty threat. That evening, Damien found her still sitting near the garden, the last light of dusk casting long shadows across the settlement. He settled beside her without a word at first, simply offering his presence as a quiet form of support before finally breaking the silence. "I've sent word to a few allied packs," he said carefully, "letting them know of the situation along our border, in case Kane decides to escalate beyond posturing." Elena nodded, appreciating his transparency, even as the reality of the situation settled more heavily over her. "I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble to your territory," she said quietly. "You didn't bring trouble," Damien replied firmly. "Kane's inability to accept that his cruelty has consequences brought this trouble. You simply had the courage to walk away from it." Elena turned to look at him, studying the steady conviction in his expression, and found herself once again grateful for the clarity he offered so consistently, a clarity that stood in stark contrast to the confusion and self-doubt Kane had cultivated in her for years. "Thank you," she said softly, "for never once making me feel like a burden." Damien's expression softened, something warm passing between them in the quiet evening air. "You could never be a burden, Elena," he said. "Not to me, and not to anyone in this pack who has taken the time to know you." Over the following weeks, Elena continued settling more fully into life within Damien's territory, her confidence growing steadily alongside the bond deepening between herself and Damien. She began taking on more responsibility during training sessions, eventually assisting Nathan in guiding newer recruits through defensive techniques, drawing on both her own hard-earned experience and the patience she had cultivated through years of quiet observation. "You have a gift for teaching," Nathan told her one afternoon, watching as she corrected a young recruit's stance with careful, encouraging guidance. "Most people forget what it felt like to struggle once they've mastered something. You haven't forgotten." Elena smiled, genuinely pleased by the observation. "I remember every moment of feeling like I wasn't good enough," she admitted. "I don't want anyone else to carry that same weight if I can help it." The work gave her a renewed sense of purpose, one entirely separate from the identity she had built around being Kane's mate, and with each passing day, she found herself further removed from the woman who had once measured her worth solely through his approval. Meanwhile, Damien's careful diplomacy along the border continued to hold, though reports from scouts suggested Kane's agitation had not diminished, merely shifted into quieter, more calculated planning. Marcus, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction his alpha seemed determined to pursue, found himself caught between loyalty and growing doubt, a tension that came to a head one evening when Kane summoned him for a private conversation. "I want a full accounting of Damien's border defenses," Kane said without preamble, pacing the length of his study as Marcus stood near the doorway. "Patrol schedules, warrior numbers, anything that might indicate weakness." Marcus hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "Alpha, with respect. Escalating this further risks far more than pride. It risks the safety of our entire pack." Kane's eyes snapped toward him, sharp and unforgiving. "Are you questioning my judgment, Marcus?" "I'm questioning the wisdom of starting a conflict over a woman who chose to leave rather than continue enduring how she was treated," Marcus replied, the words escaping before caution could fully restrain them. The room fell into tense silence, Kane's expression darkening with barely controlled fury. "You forget your place," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. Marcus held his ground, though he kept his tone respectful. "I remember my place clearly, Alpha. It's protecting this pack, even when that means speaking uncomfortable truths." Kane said nothing further, simply dismissing him with a sharp gesture, though the silence that followed carried its own kind of warning. Marcus left the study with a growing unease settling in his chest, uncertain how much longer he could continue supporting decisions he increasingly believed would lead the pack toward disaster. Across the border, unaware of the quiet dissent building within Kane's ranks, Elena continued forward with her new life, each day carrying her further from the shadow of her old one. It was during a quiet morning walk along the edge of the settlement that Damien finally voiced something he had been considering carefully for weeks. "I know this is still new," he said, his tone careful, "and I know you're still healing from everything Kane put you through. But I want you to know that whatever happens next, with him or otherwise, my intentions toward you are genuine. This isn't about proving anything to Kane. It's about you." Elena stopped walking, turning to face him fully, moved by the sincerity behind his words. "I believe you," she said softly. "And I think, somewhere along the way these past weeks, I stopped being afraid of what that means." Damien reached for her hand, gentle and certain, and for a moment, the looming tension along the border faded into the background, replaced entirely by the quiet, steady warmth of two people, slowly building something real, amid circumstances neither of them had chosen, but both of them were determined to face together. That fragile peace, however, would not last much longer. Within days, scouts reported unmistakable movement along Kane's border, warriors gathering in numbers that suggested far more than simple posturing. Whatever restraint Kane had shown during his initial confrontation at the clearing had clearly worn thin, replaced by a determination that promised the coming days would test everything Elena and Damien had begun building far sooner than either of them had hoped. The message arrived at dawn, carried by a lone messenger who approached the border under a flag of temporary truce, delivering Kane's formal demand directly into Damien's hands. Elena stood beside Damien as he read the words aloud to his assembled council, her jaw tightening with each line. "Kane demands the immediate return of his mate," Damien read, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "He claims the mate bond gives him rightful authority over her decisions, and states that failure to comply will be considered an act of aggression against his territory." The council chamber fell into tense silence, warriors exchanging uneasy glances as the weight of the demand settled over the room. Nathan was the first to break the silence, his expression hard. "The mate bond doesn't grant ownership," he said firmly. "Elena has every right to choose where she belongs." "Kane doesn't see it that way," Damien replied grimly, setting the letter down. "And he's made it clear he's willing to escalate this into open conflict if his demand isn't met." Elena stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion building within her. "This is about me," she said. "I should be the one to respond." Damien turned to her, concern evident in his expression. "Elena, you don't have to face this alone. Whatever you decide, this pack stands behind you." "I know," Elena said, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. "But Kane needs to hear directly from me that this isn't his decision to make. It never was." The council allowed her the space to speak, and within the hour, Elena stood at the border herself, facing Kane across the same clearing where she had first declared her choice weeks earlier. This time, however, she carried none of the uncertainty that had colored their previous confrontation. Instead, she stood with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had spent the past month rediscovering exactly who she was, outside the shadow of his judgment. "You cannot simply invoke the mate bond to reclaim me like property," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "A bond built on cruelty was never a true bond to begin with." Kane's expression darkened, his pride visibly wounded by her unwavering resolve. "You embarrass yourself, standing here defending your betrayal," he said coldly. "I'm not betraying anyone," Elena replied evenly. "I'm simply refusing to keep sacrificing myself for someone who never valued what I gave." The exchange grew tenser with each passing moment, until Kane, his composure finally cracking under the weight of humiliation compounding humiliation, issued a formal challenge to Damien, invoking ancient pack law that allowed disputes of this nature to be settled through direct confrontation between rival alphas, rather than outright war between their territories. Damien accepted without hesitation, understanding that refusing would only invite further aggression, while accepting offered at least the possibility of resolving the conflict without dragging both packs into a wider war that would cost far more than pride. The days leading up to the challenge passed in a haze of careful preparation and quiet anxiety. Elena found herself torn between fear for Damien's safety and a growing frustration at being reduced, once again, to a prize contested between two men, even as she understood that Damien's willingness to fight stemmed not from a desire to possess her, but from a genuine commitment to protecting her right to choose her own path. "I don't want you fighting for me as though I'm something to be won," she told him the night before the challenge, her voice tight with worry. Damien took her hands gently, his expression soft despite the tension of what awaited him. "I'm not fighting for you as a prize," he said. "I'm fighting because Kane refuses to accept that you've already made your choice, and because someone needs to make it clear that choice will be respected, one way or another. Elena studied him carefully, understanding the distinction even as worry continued to gnaw at her. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said quietly. "I promise," Damien replied, pulling her into a gentle embrace that carried more reassurance than words alone could offer. The following morning, both packs gathered at the border clearing, tension thick in the air, as Kane and Damien faced each other, prepared to settle a conflict that had been building since the night Elena first crossed into rival territory. Elena stood among Damien's warriors, her heart pounding as she watched the two men circle each other, each carrying years of rivalry and, on Kane's part, wounded pride that had curdled into something far more dangerous. The confrontation was brutal but brief, each alpha testing the other's defenses with careful, calculated movements, before the exchange grew increasingly intense. Elena watched, torn between fear and fierce hope, as Damien's steady discipline began to counter Kane's more aggressive, pride-driven attacks. Where Kane fought with the desperate need to reclaim what he considered rightfully his, Damien fought with the calm determination of someone protecting a genuine, hard-won bond. The turning point came when Kane, growing increasingly frustrated by his inability to overpower Damien's measured defense, made a reckless move, born entirely of wounded pride rather than strategy. Damien countered swiftly, decisively, ending the confrontation without unnecessary cruelty, a restraint that spoke volumes about the difference between the two men standing at the center of the clearing. Kane knelt, defeated, his pride finally shattered as thoroughly as the illusion he had built around his own authority. The gathered warriors from both packs watched in silence, the weight of the moment settling heavily over the clearing. "This ends here," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. "Elena's choice stands. She belongs to no one but herself, and she has chosen where she wishes to remain." Kane said nothing, his silence carrying the full weight of his defeat, both physical and deeply personal. As he finally rose and turned to retreat with his warriors, Elena felt something long held finally begin to release within her chest, a tension she had carried since the night he first called her useless in front of everyone she had trusted. In the weeks that followed the challenge, peace settled slowly, but steadily over both territories. Kane retreated fully into his own lands, his pride too damaged to risk further confrontation, and word eventually reached Damien's pack that Marcus had taken on a greater role in guiding the pack toward calmer, more measured leadership, gently steering Kane away from the volatility that had defined his rule for so long. Elena, meanwhile, found herself standing once again before a gathering of wolves, though this time the circumstances could not have been more different from the humiliation she had endured months earlier. Damien's entire pack had assembled in the same clearing where the challenge had taken place, drawn together to witness a moment that carried far more significance than any battle. "I once stood in a hall much like this one," Elena said, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the gathered wolves, "and I was told, in front of everyone I trusted, that I was useless. For a long time, I believed it." She paused, glancing briefly at Damien, who stood nearby, his expression carrying quiet, unwavering support. "But I've learned, over these past months, that my worth was never something anyone else had the right to define. I found that understanding, not because someone fought for me, but because I finally allowed myself to see it clearly on my own." The gathered wolves listened intently, many of them recalling the frightened, exhausted woman who had first crossed their border, now standing before them transformed into someone entirely different, someone whose quiet strength had become undeniable over the course of her time among them. "I choose to stay here," Elena continued, "not because Damien won a fight on my behalf, but because this pack, and this man, showed me what it feels like to be valued without condition. That is a choice I make freely, for myself, and I wanted every one of you to hear it directly from me." A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the gathered crowd, followed by warm applause that carried none of the awkward silence she remembered from the night her old life had shattered. Sophie, standing near the front, wiped happy tears from her eyes, while Nathan offered a proud, approving nod from where he stood among the senior warriors. Damien stepped forward once the applause settled, taking Elena's hand gently in front of the entire gathering. "This pack welcomes you not as a guest, and not as a prize won through conflict," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing, "but as Elena, exactly as you are, exactly as you choose to be." Elena felt tears gather in her own eyes, though these carried none of the pain that had once accompanied moments like this. Instead, they were tears of quiet, hard-won relief, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a single cruel word, and ended, months later, in a place where she finally understood her own worth, without needing anyone else's validation to confirm it. As the gathering slowly dispersed into celebration, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Damien, near the edge of the clearing, the same spot where she had first crossed into his territory, as a broken, uncertain woman fleeing humiliation. Looking out over the land that had become her home, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the path that had led her here, difficult as it had been. "Any regrets?" Damien asked softly, watching her carefully. Elena shook her head, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Not one," she said. "Everything that happened, all of it, led me exactly where I was always meant to be." Damien pulled her close, and as the sun began to set over the territory they now shared, Elena allowed herself, fully and without hesitation, to embrace the life she had built from the wreckage of humiliation and cruelty. She had walked away from a hall where she had been called useless, and she had walked, deliberately and courageously, into a life where her worth had never once been in question. The story of the woman who had once been called useless before an entire pack eventually faded into quiet legend among both territories, not as a tale of two rival alphas fighting over a prize, but as the story of a woman who had chosen, at every turn, to walk toward her own worth, rather than wait for someone else to grant it to her. And in the end, that choice, more than any battle or any declaration, became the true foundation of everything she built afterward, standing steady and unshaken, beside a man who had never once needed her to be anything other than exactly who she was.